there was absolutely zero idea for how you build that business. All I knew was I want to make this thing. I'm just going to start with a checklist of all the things I need to do to make this work and just write them down. And then each day I'll get up and I'll start working on that and like figure these things out.
Welcome back to Founders and Builders. Whether you already have your own business or you have the urge to start something new, this is the channel for you. Expect to find conversations with people building the future and ideas you can take into your own work and life. Today, we're joined by Will Taylor. Will previously co-founded Rota, which was at the time the UK's fastest growing on-demand staffing agency, and is now building Workflow, where creatives come to do their best work. Workflow was recently nominated by Focal as being one of Europe's top 1% of startups, and is currently growing around 20% in user base week on week. And some of my favourite parts of the episode are when Will shares how he uses Twitter to find and validate business ideas, but also how he approached raising a round of investment with no experience before. So without further ado, here is Will Taylor. Will, fantastic to be here with you today. Thanks for taking the time.
Hey, thanks for making it happen.
So you're focused on building Workflow at the minute, which is where creatives come to do their best work. But in the chat, I'd love to cover, the businesses you've built, in particular marketplaces, online and in-person marketplaces. That's where I'd love to focus, and lessons along the way for other founders or builders to take into their own lives. But before we get into it, for those that haven't met you, take us right back, like from the start. How did we get here today?
Growing up, I was always just a maker of things. When I was, honestly, just a kid, I would be taking Lego and trying to build like the biggest, most complicated car crusher possible with my dad. And then as a teenager, I was really into video games, spent far too many hours, particularly in my later teenage years, just addicted, honestly, to these different games. But around playing, I was also like building modifications for these games. So you'd take an existing game and you would change it up with new rules, new things. I was really into games design and just figuring out how can we like make fun things. And I guess kind of coming into actually building companies, I was always like a massive introvert. So like my way of sort of interacting with the world was I'm just going to make something and throw it out there and then see what happens. And so for me, just the idea of building something that impacted a lot of people and became this like amazing product in the future, really, really appeals. I guess I really got into entrepreneurship during uni. So there was this really great club which taught kind of the basics of entrepreneurships at my university. And it was this really old school P&L focused world where it's like, you're going to build a very traditional business and you present a balance sheet to the bank and then you get a loan and then you build something. And it was kind of very disconnected from the businesses that I was kind of excited by, which was like Uber, Airbnb, these really great platforms. So I became this huge student of everything that was coming out of Silicon Valley. At the time and now, to be fair, Y Combinator, one of the world's biggest incubators for startups, was producing all of this really amazing content. And I was just like an absolute sponge for it. They did this really great video series that you can dig up on YouTube, which was basically kind of startup school, they called it. 20 hours of lectures just going through different areas of building a business. And I lapped it up. And as soon as I graduated from university, I tried corporate for about 3 months, fell asleep at my desk every day. I think they wanted to kick me out. I definitely wasn't happy there. And as soon as the 3-month probation period was coming up, they said like, yeah, we can give you a job if you really want this. And I ran a mile. Have been building different styles of businesses over the last 12 years.
And I guess so you studied physics in Oxford. I guess maybe that background helped you, look at problems, break them down into smaller problems. But I'm curious, like what, from your earliest memories, what gripped you from startup school and Y Combinator? Why?
There is something amazing about building something that impacts millions of people's lives. I think one of the things that I almost didn't want from physics was everything you do is kind of cutting edge and it's amazing. You're working with like these electron microscopes, or I was doing a lot of theoretical physics. And so you're kind of on the cutting edge of string theory and things like this. It always felt like we were working with things that were very, very big, like the size of the universe, or very, very small, like subatomic particles, which were just so detached from the real world. And I wanted to do something which I'd see the fruits of our labor in like this 100 years, not in like 100 years time. So I remember I did this particular project with the physics course, which was studying like the formation of galaxies and trying to figure out, based on the different shapes of galaxies out there, what does that tell us about the start of the universe? And it was, on the face of it, really cool. In practice, it was staring at a computer for 12 hours a day in a lab underground, not interacting with anyone. And it was basically the opposite of what I wanted to be doing. So coming out of university, I was kind of thinking, yes, I want to do something that's innovative and exciting and all these fun things that people want to do. But it really taught me that something that's very important to me is making an impact. And so I was just oriented towards what are things that I could do right now, today, that are going to make an impact on someone that I know and sort of help them out.
And that was where a couple of your first ventures started. So you talked about the CV writing business.
Yes.
Laundry as a service. Like, walk us through it.
Sure. So my first attempt at business was not a great success, but it was getting the ball rolling. So I had written a whole bunch of CVs for friends of mine, particularly a lot of people coming out of STEM are just not the best communicators, and they would usually do like this massive wall of text. And I really enjoyed rewriting these and helping them sort of market themselves and present themselves to people. And after I'd done this like 3 or 4 times, I was like, I should probably get paid for this. So it just struck me as like a problem that a lot of people I knew who were other students graduating had. And so for better or for worse, without really thinking about the long-term business strategy or anything, I just set up a website and started writing CVs for people. And what that evolved into was I had a team of 5 writers who were writing CVs for different people who came in through the website. And we started to get a book together. We started thinking about how can we do consulting for people who are further on in your career, which in hindsight is kind of laughable because you'd have this like really experienced 40-year-old consultant who knows so much more than you pick up the phone, and there you are, like 22 years old, voice as high as you like, sounding incredibly green, telling them what to do in terms of career strategy, but more in the sense of you've got something really good. How do you like communicate that, to a lay person like myself who also doesn't know anything about your industry? There's some things there. And I guess like one thing, honestly, that's come out of that business, which definitely isn't a lot of money, is thinking about the craft of nonfiction writing. So to build that business, I really went deep on like understanding how do you communicate ideas really quickly and in the shortest amount of time. And that skill has become absolutely amazing in that it unlocks things like investment, it unlocks sales, it unlocks communicating with your team. When you've got like a large team and you need to broadcast something, how do you put something out there that gets everyone fired up and gets everyone on the same page about where you're going? So the one thing I took away from that is just the skill of writing is really worth studying, and it's just such a long-term win, as well as helping you think about problems. Like I do every 2-week investor update these days. And for me, just the act of thinking about the business and like structuring how I'm going to describe it to investors is like a huge part of my process for just managing the company. So anyway, let's wind way back. So a CV writing business is actually a terrible business to run because you have to spend all this money and time trying to find your customer. And if you do a really good job, they will never come back because they've got this great CV and they're going to use that same CV for the next 10 years.
Customer retention, what is that?
Yeah, exactly.
They're
Who needs
gone.
it? Yeah. Recurring revenue, what?
Yeah.
So
that's if you've helped them be a success.
Yeah,
but if they've had to retake final year.
I know, right? So ultimately, I just couldn't figure out a way to make that scale. It was really difficult. And I started thinking more along the lines of technology as the way of helping more people. So I started thinking about other problems I had and other things that I could do that would be exciting. And again, just being like a fresh grad, starting with the problems one of the problems you have as a student is laundry.
It's a big problem.
It's a big problem. You don't want to do it. It's a pain in the bum. You have to do it every week or so. So I was really into how can we just solve this stupid, niggly thing that every single person experiences. And about that same time, there was this startup in the US out in Silicon Valley called Launder App. You could book in your local dry cleaner to basically come to your house, pick up your laundry, and then bring it back fresh and ironed and done for you. It's like a really awesome service. And that kind of thing hadn't really come over to the UK yet. So I was kind of interested in, would that work? Should we build something here? Should we try it out? Now, just to sort of put this into context, I don't really know how to program. I have no idea how to market. I really don't know how to sell this thing. There was absolutely zero idea for how you build that business. Mm-hmm. All I knew was I want to make this thing. Mm-hmm. I'm just going to start with a checklist of all the things I need to do to make this work and just write them down. And then each day I'll get up and I'll start working on that and like figure these things out. So firstly, this is just coming out of like YC good practice. They say you want to validate things before you build them. Make sure that you're not just building something that nobody wants. So to do that, what I did is I took a screenshot of the Just Eat website where it shows all of like different takeaways. I then very poorly photoshopped in shirts and trousers over the takeaways and like changed the wording around. Printed that out, and I went around all of these dry cleaners, just literally knocking door to door in Chelsea, which is like one of the more like fancy areas of London, of course.
So you found the customers that could pay.
Yeah, exactly. I went not to the customers per se, but in this case to the dry cleaners to see if they had signed up to the platform. Mm-hmm. I was like, hey, here's a platform I've built, which was a lie. But do you want to get on board and I can bring you customers? So after doing that, I had, I think, 15 or 20 different dry cleaners. And they were all like, yeah, if you can bring me a customer, fine, I'll take the order. But it was like really important that I checked that worked. And then I was pretty confident, and I would say maybe almost like overconfident, that I would easily be able to acquire customers on the other side if we provided this great service. And I felt like just going up to a customer and saying like, do you want to book in today if I can't actually deliver that service was going to be a bad experience. So after I'd actually checked that we could get the suppliers on board, I then set out starting to build this thing. And I'd never built anything at all, but I just went online, followed some tutorials, drew some things out these days you use Figma. Back then it was, I think Sketch was this like Figma-esque kind of prototype thing. And I built this really janky platform that basically allows you to log in, click on a few items, build a shopping cart of things that you wanted to get cleaned, which was not a great experience because it's so much slower to build a shopping cart of all the clothes you need cleans. But anyway, we learn. And then take that and buy the order. Now, one thing I did that was really good, I think, is that once I'd built that really terrible site, I then went out onto, Liverpool Street, in fact, where I knew there'd be like a really high density of people who would be using this service. So Liverpool Street, for people who don't know, it's kind of the city, the center of finance for London. There's a lot of people who are money rich, time poor. Mm-hmm. And what I wanted to do is just check they could use the software. So I had this really janky app, usually on my phone. I would go up to people on their lunch break and be like, hey, I want you to just book in laundry using this and just watch them use it. Watch them try and use the calendar function that I'd built in, and like they couldn't move to the next month and all this like janky stuff that they couldn't figure out. And I'd take all those learnings from that day of watching people fail, go back, build the next version of the app that kind of solved those. The next day I'd be out there putting it in front of people again. Hey, this is really embarrassing, but do you want to just like try this app I'm building? Could you book yourself in some laundry? Watch them fail on it again, go back and then build it again. And
at the time, I mean, these things exist in London now, and I'm sure they're super prevalent. I've used a couple in the past, but this was new.
Yeah, this was like a very unproven idea, and it wasn't really clear what the experience should look like. So like the whole reason for this whole shopping cart thing was just the only model I had in my head was Just Eat, booking in a takeaway. And so you're just kind of like figuring this stuff out. But one of the things that actually helped that really actually get off the ground was spending a lot of time with customers. It's very tempting once you get into coding to kind of make something perfect and to basically like lock yourself in a cave for 6 months and then come out when you've got like the finished article and it's got all the features that you think people are going to need. And I kind of did the reverse of that, build something that wasn't really working, but get it in front of people and iterate to something that did work. So I built something and eventually got to a point where pretty much everyone could go through the app and have that experience. And also, I mean, I just want to highlight that process of doing these guerrilla user testing interviews is just the reps you need to become like a really good designer later on. So it started building out that skill set, which we'll definitely come back to if we're talking about like things I've done later.
What I love about what I'm hearing is that you didn't look at like all of the playbooks for products, these methodologies of like jobs to be done or like the 3 whys or any of these that product teams use today. You just figured like I have to de-risk, would people even use this?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of naivety in there as well. I'm not going to lie. And look, I am a voracious reader. I love reading and taking in these things. There's like a book called Lean UX that was pretty good. There's like Designing Brand Identity, which is pretty good. But I've honestly found that most of these books are oriented towards the scale-ups and these larger companies where, you know, that lots of people have this problem. They're not often oriented towards these kind of solo founders just figuring things out. And so genuinely, I think like you might actually do better just to think from first principles for yourself. What do I need to do to start testing this to a degree? And yeah, then like the final piece of the puzzle was, right, we've got something that works. How do we get it out there? And so I decided that door-to-door sales and leaflets were the way. Didn't have any money.
Old school.
So I was going to have to do it myself. And I know this sounds strange from someone who's on a podcast at this point, but I still am, but I was at that point a massive introvert. Even like building up the confidence to go out and speak to the bankers and like to get them to use it for these user tests, I found extremely nerve-wracking. And so just the idea of doing door-to-door sales, I remember I dragged my long-suffering girlfriend out with me and she was just like, Will, just press the doorbell. And I was just like hovering like, what am I going to say? I was just so nervous about the whole thing. And then I did a load of like leafleting. I'd just be standing there like in the rain, handing out one leaflet at a time, like trying to get people to take it. And the idea here, because it sounds super primitive, is just if you can validate that something works kind of end to end and you can get the kind of prototype of a business together, then you can build a business around that. The one thing I didn't want to do at that stage, and maybe I didn't really think I would be entitled to do, was to raise money and like have a bunch of people. Like I could then, today I would just pay a bunch of leafleters and it'd be done. I'd have like 30 out there tomorrow. Back then, it was really about just doing whatever I could with whatever resources I had and doing it. And I guess there's one other thing that's useful if we're thinking about the future, just to talk about this stage, which is like, how did I fund this? Like, did you not have a day job? You're in the middle of the street handing out leaflets. That's kind of insane.
Because you were balancing this with studies at the same time. Had you floated the idea in your head that maybe somebody would like to invest in this idea?
Yeah, no, I was just like, no one wants to invest in someone like me. Like, why would you do that? That's insane. Give me money? No. So I just wanted to prove it and basically like be so good they can't ignore you, that kind of mentality. And while I was doing that, I also took on some side gigs where I'd be tutoring people or I would be working on websites. Once I'd learned how to build a website for the startup, then actually that's a really high value skill and you can point to what you've built and then people are really happy to hire you. And all of that like side hustle stuff, which I needed to do just to sort of pay my bills, actually became really valuable later on, because then when I was looking to raise or when I was looking to hire, people knew who you were. And you had people who like believed in you because they could see the work ethic and so on. The other thing is, as well as like trying to earn just enough to pay my bills, I had this like mentality of I'm going to keep my bills absolutely rock bottom. And so instead of like renting a normal place, I went and found this like abandoned building that needed live-in security, which was like right on Old Street. So this is like the center of tech startups. So I'd be like right in the heart of the action. And called up the security company. They said, yeah, there's a waiting list. There's no chance you're going to be doing this. I just called them like 7 times that day. I just kept asking like, hey, has anything come up? Has anything come up? And then literally the next day they just said like, you can have the building. It's fine. Just stop calling us. You can have it. It's fine. So I ended up moving in. It was just myself in this huge empty recording studio, 6 stories, like really old school office, like blue carpets, cubicles. My bedroom at this time, I'm like 22, was this cubicle with like really thin walls that you have, which I'm not sure if my girlfriend at the time really approved of. But what was great about that was I was living in the center of London for like £300 a month. And so like the amount of time I needed to spend doing side hustles to pay for the rent was really low, and I could spend like all the rest of my bandwidth on building my startups. And what I ended up doing was basically moving in all of my friends from uni and school. So we ended up with this like kind of hacker house thing going on, which was like a lot of fun, like in your early 20s.
Just before we started recording the podcast, we were talking about like making bets and leverage and choosing, you know, like at that point in your life, you were thinking, keep my burn as low as possible. I just need to survive while I play around in whatever direction I'm curious in.
Totally.
But then, you know, as you started more and more ventures, you're more willing to make that trade-off of time for money.
Yeah, exactly. In the first few ventures, I would just go all in on one part of the business, like, oh, I'm doing tech for 3 months or something. And so actually proving these things out took quite a while back then. And yeah, that's definitely something that I've kind of evolved my thinking on in terms of like the time value of momentum, basically like moving quicker.
So with the on-demand laundry business, I know you then got into the kind of like driver-side logistics business for, you know, what people would know today as like Deliveroo or Uber Eats.
Totally.
But I'm curious, what happened with the laundry app business? You said it failed. So was the risk in there that, you know, students or professionals weren't willing to pay?
Yeah. So the issue is, and this is kind of coming to like starting to understand how to build a marketplace. Once you've found your dry cleaner and you really trust them, there isn't really a need to go through a marketplace platform to book them in. You know, you can call them up, and I guess not everybody wants to call them up. Some people do prefer to use an app, but you can just call them up. You can just do a walk-in. Often, if you are somebody who is, let's say, a banker, you will have a dry cleaner in the station where you commute from. And so you actually don't have as much need for that as you would do. People were also not working from home as much. So it's actually kind of inconvenient to be at home to like manage both the pickup and delivery. There's all these things that you kind of figure out. But like the big thing ultimately that I think didn't work with that business model is that once you find a dry cleaner, you don't need to change. And like one thing that's really important for marketplaces is you want something where it's actually quite valuable to you to be able to choose different options when you come back to it. For example, when you go for a takeaway, you actually want to try something new most of the time, which is why you don't go back to the same one again and again. You go back on Just Eat to explore, or Uber Eats to explore. So there's just this dynamic of trying to think about the decision-making from the perspective of a user, and ideally have things where it's very high frequency of transaction. So they're doing it all the time. It's a recurring problem, big tick for laundry. But then once you found somebody, you actually don't mind having someone different the next time. Again, like Uber, another example, you don't necessarily want the same cabbie back. You want the closest cabbie to pick you up.
Sure.
So ultimately, what I couldn't get to work is I couldn't get the cost of acquisition down because it was quite hard to find these people who were like time poor and like had money.
And then when they would use you, they would churn.
They would churn.
After the first transaction.
Exactly. They're like, oh, this is a really good dry cleaner. I'm just going to go straight to them next time.
Yeah.
And actually, that's happened for the entire ecosystem of laundry apps. There's like one or two still surviving in London. They're not that big. Most of them haven't really been able to go regional. Launder app in the US fails.
Yeah.
And I think there's just a learning there that just copying something that's working or looks like it's working, like raising a lot of funds, all this stuff, isn't the best strategy. I would definitely advise against just copying something because you think it's taking off.
Yeah. There are so many examples of these kind of in-person marketplaces where once you've acquired the customer, you're basically starting from zero again and again.
Totally.
Services that come to mind that I've spoken with other founders about, like personal trainers.
Yeah.
You form this like intimate bond. You know, you're not dealing in a commoditized service like taking a taxi. It just needs to get me from A to B.
Totally.
I form a relationship with this person. I build trust with this person. And the brand I associate is not with the marketplace anymore.
Right.
That's kind of secondary. It's with that individual that helped me.
Exactly that. And that kind of brings me on to that next piece you were just mentioning, if this is helpful.
For sure.
So yeah, that kind of brings me on to this next piece. One of the big problems that I saw with dry cleaning businesses was they really struggled to find drivers. They often had like one or two who they relied on, but if that person went away, they were on holiday, suddenly the driver, the owner of the business is out there driving things around, sticking shirts in the back of their car and like trying to make it work. So this was just like a persistent problem that I saw. And I kind of had this vision of, well, all of these different dry cleaners that I'm working with, why don't they just share the same pool of drivers? And so I ended up building this platform that was kind of like a logistics network. So you could book in a driver as a dry cleaner or a takeaway or, you know, a delivery service for a retail shop. They want to send something to a customer. And then we would get the request. We would then route it to the nearest driver. We would then choose like a route for the driver. So they might be able to pick up two other things, a bit like an Uber pool, and then do the deliveries after that. And the value for the driver is they get to do more deliveries per hour. So they're earning more. And at the same time, it's very reliable and like efficient for whichever company it is. So firstly, got to build the tech. And so this time I can understand how to build websites, but I had to figure out all of this stuff around how do you do, it's kind of the traveling salesman problem where you've got these 3 different destinations that people need to get to and you need to figure out what is the routes to get to those. So I was building some like software around like, and the logic around how would you route people and manage that side of things. And then we were just using that internally. What we did to like validate this problem this time is I just basically gave my phone number to a whole bunch of drivers and a whole bunch of dry cleaners. And I said, text this and I will make it happen. And then we had like a spreadsheet and we just like received a text in one ear, called up 3 drivers. Hey, can you do this? There was no like tech involved. We really need you to pick up this cleaning and go deliver it.
When you say we,
yeah, so I ended up working with this really awesome guy called Martin, who had basically ran a e-commerce bike shop before. And yeah, he was just a really thoughtful, fun person to work with. So yeah, how did I meet Martin? I think me and him met at one of these startup events around Old Street. So definitely speaks to the value of being inside the center of where startups are happening. You meet other people who are doing the same thing. Anyway, we got on, we kind of liked this idea. We didn't really know each other that well, but we were just like, let's try it. It could work out. And so, yeah, we basically did everything together. There was no like division of labor. It was just like, if we're going out speaking to takeaways today, we'll go walk together. We'll have more fun that way. If we're going to go be up until 11 p.m. taking in orders and like routing them around, we'll do that together. We'll just sit and work it out. And it was just fun. You know, it was a fun thing to do. Now, the downside of this is, although on the face of it, it kind of makes sense to have this logistics layer, you still have to acquire both sides of the marketplace economically. And if you look, this is like getting very theoretical, but if you look at like the business model for Deliveroo, which basically has the same thing, the operational layer is not where the money is. Deliveroo makes money because they own the customer. They can charge a markup on the food, and they can also do advertising. So like the different takeaways will compete to be in the listings at the highest point, and they'll pay a massive premium for that. That's how Deliveroo makes money. The whole charging takeaways £3 to do delivery is, if anything, if it's break even, I'll be amazed. I'm sure it's like making them a loss. So the economics of running this distribution center kind of system, it's really, really poor, and it doesn't scale that well outside of really high density environments like London. So I know it sounds like a bit negative to say like, oh, we tried and we failed again, but we tried, we got something up and running, we had some revenue coming through. What we discovered actually was that people would be stealing drivers off the marketplace because, again, once you found a good driver, you don't necessarily need another one.
Yep.
And, there is an advantage to having a quick driver who's nearby, but often these people just took it to reduce the costs for them.
I think the point you mentioned around there's no money in the operation side of the business.
Yeah.
Which is probably the hardest side of the business and requires the most, humans to throw at the problem to solve it.
Totally.
It's probably why, I'm curious to get your thoughts, probably why a lot of the last mile delivery services, because they didn't have this ability to upsell and market to new customers on the demand side, struggled to exist.
Absolutely. There's this really interesting question that I don't see a lot of people asking, which is when they go into an industry, where is the money made? Like, where is the real money made? So in software, for example, there's a lot of software you can download for free, like Trello or one of these project management solutions or whatever, or Slack, you can get started for free. And you might think, oh, well, once a business, a 10-person business gets on Slack and they start paying for the premium version, then I guess they make their profit there. But just to take Slack as one example, I think something like half of their revenue comes from their top 500 biggest clients. Like, all of the money is serving enterprise, really. And then you've got like these millions of other companies that are kind of good, but they're not really that important in the long tail. And I guess like, if you can just like identify an industry, where the value is, and ideally just do that bit if it's possible, then you become really valuable. So yeah.
I'd love to get to, when we discuss workflow a bit later on, I'd love to get to the benefits and equally downfalls of starting with high-end enterprise, because one of the things that I'd love to get your thoughts on is customer validation and this kind of feedback loop of what do we build for who, what do they care about,
right?
Which is inevitably much harder with enterprise,
as you will well know with your background in
been there,
enterprise.
done that.
Yeah, exactly.
So you're building, marketplace businesses. First one was consumer. Second one was B2B. Then you got started on the early innings of Rota, which was the first business that, we've discussed a couple of that were, whilst you were a student, almost side projects that you learned a bunch from. How did Rota start?
So we had sort of pivoted Driver Hunt into basically a jobs board, because there was still a massive demand for drivers. And basically by charging a one-off fee for either listing your advert for drivers or whatever, we were able to do a really low touch business that was just turning over money, paying rent. Almost all the takeaways in Shoreditch were on it. It was just like the place to get your drivers. And it was a fine little business, but it wasn't going to become anything big. So obviously I was looking to do something that was way, way bigger than that. I was introduced to my future co-founder, Tom, through mutual friends, where I'd kind of been to this entrepreneur's dinner, where basically like a whole bunch of people come together and they talk about what they've been working on. And I've been saying, hey, I do marketplaces. I've been doing these things, just sort of figuring things out. And Tom had been to the same dinner, but on like a previous week, because it was like a recurring thing. So this mutual friend just said like, hey, you two should speak. Like, Tom's got a good idea. You might have some advice for him. We met in the Shoreditch Grind, which is this coffee shop just off Old Street Roundabout. And he said, yeah, so I've been thinking about this idea of Uber, but for staffing. He came from this background where his parents ran a hotel just outside of London. and they had to book in temporary staff for all the events, like if they have a wedding or if they have like a really big party thrown, like an office party, they have to book that in through a recruitment agent. And the recruitment agents were basically a bit of a nightmare to work with. Like you just never knew who you were going to get. They were really not easy to work with and seemed a bit shady. So he thought, like, can we do like an Uber style business for staffing where you can book in staff through a platform? Now, I'd been building this for a while. So I was like, I know exactly what we're going to do. This is how we build the products. This is how we build the algorithm. This is how we get funding. These are the teams we need. This is what the next 6 months looks like. So it was one of those like opportunities where you just instantly know that this is going to work and exactly how to do it. And so I like on the spot, pretty much like in this first meeting, planned out the whole business with him, got the deck together. And then we had this agreement that basically he was on this like high growth trajectory career in Accenture as a strategy consultant, which is like the hot part of Accenture as well. And probably on the partner track, like he was going to be earning multiple 6 figures, if not 7 figures in a couple of years. He would only skip that and do this crazy startup with me, a guy who's never met before, on the condition that I can raise 100K to get the thing going.
So here comes your sales pitch for Tom.
Yeah, exactly. The sales pitch was pure enthusiasm and yeah, I'll sign up to that. I'll get you the 100K and we're going to do this. And then you're going to quit your job and we're going to build this thing. So we met in the middle of August. And one of the things that was really obvious to us was hospitality, which was going to be our first market because it's what Tom knew really, really well, kicks off around Christmas. And you have all of these parties and it's like, just like almost all of your revenue as a hospitality business happens in that time. So we needed to get our platform into the market right away. So the first thing was obviously get Tom to quit his job and get the funding in. In parallel though, we have to get these platforms out there and get them released. So on the funding side, I started running around London, just trying to meet anybody I had met through any tangential relationship. Like if I've done a contracting job for them, if I've done tutoring for them, if they're a friend who I met like 3 times in a bar, I'm going out to meeting them. I lay out the pitch deck. We're building Uber for staffing. Do you want to be in? And if they said yes, I didn't care how big the check was, they're coming in. So we had £500 check from one person. We had like £2,000 from another person. It was literally whatever people could spare, they were putting into the pot. And we ended up with this really long cap table of all these investors just in the first rounds. And then like 1 or 2 people who came in and put in like £1,000 were like, yeah, you should also speak to my uncle. And then the uncle would come in, they'd put like 20 grand in or something like that.
So the lesson is find more uncles.
Find more uncles, yeah.
Uncles rock.
Good people to know. And aunts, you know. Probably our biggest investor in our first round was this lady who ran a shipping company. And I have almost no idea how I knew them. I think their partner had worked with me on one thing, but they'd like been a different part of the business. And so I'm going through my phone book at this point, just like crossing off everybody I know. And I met this partner. He went to the lady and she was in and like she sealed the rounds. So got the money in. It actually took only about 3 days to raise our first 30K. And then once we had the 30K, we could say like, everyone's coming in on this. Do you want in or not? And you kind of had this FOMO where people didn't want to miss out. And so we were able to sort of wrap that up in, I think, the next couple of weeks.
I've spoken to quite a lot of founders actually that, have looked at angles like crowdfunding, there's plenty of platforms online. And for the amount of money that you were raising to get Rota, the first version, off the ground, you could have equally, let's put the brakes on, let's consider a big like funding strategy.
Yeah.
We need to create this content, sell it to these big ticket investors. But it just goes back to what I've heard time and time again, you're about in the way that you work, which is, I know what I need to do. I'm just going to put the reps in to get it done.
Yeah. I think that definitely sums it up. Yeah. I think like moving very quickly on opportunity, like seeing this thing just in the first meeting and deciding right then and there, I was going to shut down this previous business. Like I didn't put it on ice. I literally shut it down and turned off the website so it wouldn't be a distraction and just went all in on this. I think it's something you can do once you've like been thinking about an area for a long time and you're kind of like ready to go. So
it's that, you know, luck favors the prepared mind.
Yeah, totally. Exactly. So we just raised like the 100K. We didn't have any way to take that money in because no bank would like open with us. So we ended up like only actually taking the money in like 2 months later. And we had all these contractors who were working for us building the apps. I just had to like promise them like, the money is coming, we've got it. We just can't give it to you right now because we can't take it off the investors. I like paid them out of pocket what I could, and like was just promising them that it would come through. We were like opening bank accounts with like 6 banks at the same time to try and like see who would win the race. And we were like, we don't care about your terms, just whatever it is. If you open, we've got a business. So that's on the like funding side. And then on the product side, this again speaks to the value of being in the center of London. So I was living in Shoreditch and I was working mostly out of coffee shops. Like I would say 90% of my career has been working out of a coffee shop. And while I was probably sending emails out to people who I'd worked with before, I heard on the next table over this guy talking about how his current startup wasn't really working. He was speaking to a recruiter and like saying, yeah, I'm thinking about getting back in the market. And he was just on this phone call and I kind of got the gist that he was like a techie. And so as soon as he hung up the phone, I was like over there like a rocket and jumped on that. And he became like our CTO, basically. And I basically sold the vision to him. But like, it really speaks to like just being where the action is allows that kind of thing to spontaneously occur. And then he ended up bringing in a whole bunch of his tech friends to be able to like build out the tech team. So then it was like me doing a lot of the tech, him doing a lot of the tech, this one other person doing a lot of the tech. We had to get this into the market right away.
You were coming up to peak, you know, season. You needed it in by October. I think Christmas parties were like the big event that you needed to make sure you were in place for.
Exactly. So we had 4 weeks to get something into the market so we wouldn't miss the start of that rush. Because as soon as those companies start booking in and planning their operations, they're going to be like, shut us down, just focus on delivering. So from when we founded, it took us, as I say, 4 weeks to build the first 6 platforms. So that's iOS, Android, and web on both like employer side and worker side. Because again, we just didn't want people to be like shut out. Got those shipped. And then we had this really successful run into Christmas where I think in October we did like 6K revenue, November like 20K revenue, December like 30K revenue. So just immediately had a really good business. And that basically teed us up to do a really strong funding round to actually build a proper business out of it in January.
And for those that haven't used Rota, it was really, I mean, I've looked at the app. I actually used it myself when I was back studying.
Oh, cool.
And it was as easy as, you know, signing up online, telling you if I could make coffees, if I could work in hotels. But you actually built in this like quality control. So there was a human element to it where you had to come in and get your like Rota certification.
Yes, absolutely. This is such a hard thing to get right in marketplaces. So often the thing people hate about buying things online is when you get something that is just sub quality. Like we've all bought things off Amazon that have turned up and it's just not what you expected. It's fallen apart and you're like, I probably shouldn't have listed this by like lowest price first because I've got something rubbish. So with staffing in particular, it's really common to have people who don't really care about the job turn up and they're just trying to get a paycheck. And it's understandable, like we've all been demotivated. One of the things we really tried to optimize for was basically quality of staff. And the way we did that was kind of twofold. One, by giving staff this really great experience. We paid about 10% more than they would be getting anywhere else. And like a big part of our mission was basically raising wages. 2, giving people control of where they work. 3, doing the rating system, which means that the employer was like incentivized to look after them. So like when you had some random employer come on the app and they started like abusing the staff or like yelling at them and being mean, they got like really low ratings and almost immediately like chucked off the app. So the value proposition for the staff was really amazing. And we got basically the best quality staff come to us. I think something that a lot of people got wrong is they came to this platform, they thought like, oh, as long as we have the jobs, the staff will come. Oh, we've got money, everything else doesn't matter.
Everybody needs work.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Who cares about the staff? We'll do whatever. And actually we like really emphasized the staff experience, built a reputation for it, and then ended up having like the best staff in London at that time coming to us to be the place they worked. So yeah, optimized for quality on that side. And then on the other side, we were able to get on board some really large employers. So what's really important for marketplaces is you have critical mass so that when you go to the app, you actually have what you want to be there. So for example, if you go to a takeaway app and you can't see anything local to you, or there's just one takeaway there, that app isn't very valuable. So for us, we need to make sure that every time like a staff member logged in, they could see a shift in the app and they could book themselves into something. And we even had this thing where if there'd been a lot of shifts, we would not hide the shifts that weren't available. We'd show they had been there. They'd just been a bit slow and they hadn't been able to like book themselves onto it. Basically making sure people knew like this was what was happening. And a part of that strategy was going into the highest volume employers straight away. So we went into like Marriott Hotels, which is like this huge hotel chain, obviously, Mayfair Hotels, and there was one other really big one that we got in. I'm forgetting the name of. But we really targeted that to get critical mass rather than the much easier place to start, which would have been all of the independent shops. They would have been so much easier to sell to, so much quicker to jump on the app, probably early adopters of new tech compared to like some of these old school operations, but it wouldn't have allowed us to get critical mass of shifts on the app.
What I love about what you're saying is that you're talking about the cold start problem and making sure that I'd be curious to get your thoughts actually, because, both sides of the marketplace were risky.
Yeah.
Workers needed to know that there were jobs there to make it worth their while to even go through your certification, where you had to actually visit Rota's offices in-house, show that you could pour wine in a certain way, show that you were a qualified barista and you could make like 3 different types of cool flat whites with all the fancy artwork on.
Absolutely.
Which I failed, by the way.
No way.
Yeah. But we won't get into that. But then on the supply side, as you mentioned, probably quicker to validate would have been these smaller businesses that knew they had work and could act quick.
Yep.
But you were a small team at the time. I mean, if I'm right, by January 2016, so you've been working on the project for 4 or 5 months, you were 20 people. Average age was like 24, 25 years old.
Yes.
You didn't have all the time in the world to go across 100 different supply side events, companies or hotels that needed staff.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. So we were very intentional about doing that. And one of the ways that we were able to get to critical mass was we were very limited in what we would put on the marketplace. So firstly, we didn't do all staffing. We did just hospitality. But even within hospitality, we did basically 2 things, waiting and bartending. We did that for like the first year. So if you wanted to work in the kitchen, if you were these different types of chef, we weren't interested. The only 2 roles we wanted to do were these really high volume roles. And ultimately that allowed us to just focus in and get that really correct and make sure there was liquidity on the market.
Talk to us about liquidity on the market and how that kind of relates to the cold start problem.
Yeah. So what you want is lots of transactions happening. Obviously that's what drove revenue, but it's also this ability to fulfill customer expectations that I talked about. So like if you're an employer, if you put a shift in, it gets fulfilled. If you are a worker, you can see work on the app. You can rely on going on there and checking it regularly to be able to find work. So it's just really important to have that. When you're small and you're starting out, if you want to be strategic about it, what you want to do is you want to sort of find the minimum amount of effort that your team has to do in terms of what's the smallest number of suppliers or buyers that you can bring on that will provide liquidity in a very, very, very tightly defined niche. And you just nail that one niche. And once you've done that really well, then you can expand to other geographies. You can expand to other roles and things like that.
And then, so you did your kind of family and friends round where you were asking anybody, hey, here's the pitch deck.
Yep.
We need to invest. And then in September of 2016, you raised again. Now, talk to us about the profile of the team that you built. What was top of mind at the time?
Yeah. I mean, honestly, so naive. We had a really awesome team and we didn't like make too many mistakes. So I'm going to credit my co-founder, Tom, for bringing some wisdom to the team that I may have lacked. I brought the enthusiasm. But what we ended up with was basically a very young, not by choice, but just by chance in terms of who was interested in this kind of project. Young team, average age of 25, including all the managers, working in a WeWork at the time when WeWork was offering free beer from like 5 p.m. till late.
Dangerous.
Very, very dangerous. So you'd have like staff members walking around with a tray with like 12 different drinks on it, which is not a good look. But everyone, and this is a hospitality startup as well. So you've got all these salespeople from ex-hospitality and they love to party. I mean, even our clients were, some of them after hours knew how to throw a good after party. I remember one of our biggest champions in a big brand chain, which I won't go into, unfortunately got fired because they had thrown this party in their big establishment, which I'm not going to name. And all of their friends had come over. Those friends had invited more friends, let a load of people in through the fire exit at the back door. They set off all the fire extinguishers. They had like turned the place upside down. And we were like, I'm going to make up a name. Ben. This is not his name. Ben, I love you. Why do you have to do that? You're our biggest champion at this huge company.
Ben, wherever you are, you need to invite us to your parties.
Oh, he was a blast. He was fun. Yeah. But yeah, so anyway, ended up with this like really fun-loving team, but also really hardworking, and almost to a point where we had to like put our foot on the gas, on the brake somewhat. Mm-hmm. So everyone was working till like 9+ p.m. every day of the week, and often the weekends as well. We actually said like on Wednesday, we're going to institute everyone goes home at 6. Mm-hmm. We do not want people burning out. But it was like a really fast moving team. Like people were really fired up. They were really fired up by the mission. And it kind of helped us basically become one of the largest in the country pretty quickly.
I remember at the time you expanded from London. I think you were looking at potentially going into other cities in the UK. I think Manchester was top of mind, maybe Leeds. And then COVID hit. And you've got this really human intensive business.
Yeah.
Where, you know, you're making like a margin on the transaction every time somebody goes for a staffing job.
Yep, totally.
And people are loving it. The reviews are going super well. Hotels are really happy because you've nailed the quality bar of who they're bringing in versus all these agencies that are just putting people into shifts.
Totally.
COVID hits, the world changes. What happens?
So it was a shock to pretty much everyone. But actually I can wind back because when COVID hit, I had actually put in place a new CEO to run the company at that point. So what we did was we proved it out in London and then we went to nationalize. We went to Edinburgh, Glasgow, Leeds, as you mentioned, Manchester, Birmingham, all these areas and started deploying. And what we discovered was that there isn't the critical mass of shifts that you need to make this really profitable nationally and to build like a big company there. We could get in there. We had little operations, but it was never going to be a successful company in those areas. And one of the things that made that really hard was we had so much competition. So yes, we were the largest at that time, but actually this idea of like Uber for staffing was kind of an obvious idea. And there were 4 or 5 competitors who maybe missed that first Christmas rush we talked about, but actually sprung up and raised a lot of capital immediately afterwards. Mm-hmm. And so in every single one of these geographies, it was just like a knife fight, like trying to win over the big employers in that area and have them use you exclusively. So the cost to acquire went up loads. You're competing to get the staff. It was really, really difficult to build a business and like that. So at this point, it becomes clear that we've solved everything in tech that we're going to be solving. There's no more engineering or algorithms we're going to be building out here. This is just a case of rolling out this tech-enabled recruitment agent to the rest of the UK. But because of the dynamics of the size of the market and the competition, this is going to be like a slow growth company. Mm-hmm. So I always wanted to build something much, much bigger. I didn't want to let down all these people who had backed me as well. So I did this like as long as I could. And it got to a point where I felt like I actually was kind of not serving a bigger mission that I had available. So we found a amazing CEO who'd run recruitment agencies and taken them from 10 million in revenue through to 50 million in revenue. They've seen the next step. We had an adult conversation with the board and just said, look, let's bring this person in. We'll try it out, see if it works. And ultimately, they ended up running the company. And for me, that allowed me to like basically think about what's the next big thing. Mm-hmm. I'm a shareholder. That's great. If the company succeeds, I succeed. Mm-hmm. But he ran that. So then come to COVID. When COVID hit, that company decided to use that almost as an opportunity to look at how can it solve this problem that I was talking about of nationalizing being really difficult. How can it still become a big company, and how can it exploit the bit that's really innovative is the tech. And I was very close to the team there. What they decided to do was basically turn this into a software platform for managing your staff, so that if you're like a really big employer, you can manage all of your different staff inside this. That started to grow, and then the team, successfully managed to sell that to a private equity a couple of years later. Mm-hmm. So great outcome for all the shareholders. Great outcome for the team. It found a really, really good home. And also kind of using COVID as I guess it was a way to do that shift mm-hmm. without letting down their previous clients who, and all the staff would be relying on them for work. Mm-hmm. So like all the staff were moved onto other platforms. They found new work and all this sort of thing.
What stands out to me is that Rota, when you think about it being a marketplace business, was very similar and characteristic to the first ventures that you were working on with the on-demand laundry, in that the service was entirely a commodity.
Yeah.
When you looked back, totally. Joining the dots backwards, there was some kind of there was some nice tech going on in the routing of staff to job and optimization of when a certain amount of people on the marketplace will be available. But at the end of the day, you were kind of in perfect competition.
Yep.
Rather than defensible tech, a difference in user experience. Yes, you could argue that for the end customer, the hotels, you were bringing in a higher quality of worker. And for the workers, you were bringing in a guaranteed higher quality because of the peer review system. But at the end of the day, it felt pretty close to perfect competition.
Yeah, it felt like that to us as well. Yeah. You kind of want to build a business where your customers potentially are like, oh, this is expensive, but I just have to get this because it's so essential. Mm-hmm. But for us, like if we increased margins by like 2%, mm-hmm. the employers would suddenly shift to a different platform. Or not that we would, but if we had decreased wages by 1%, the staff rightly would go to the next platform over who's paying more.
Yeah.
So yeah, we were just stuck in this like thin margin business. And it definitely shaped my thinking about what kind of things I wanted to go after next, where it wasn't an obvious problem. And it was something where you could go really deep on the tech and build something that's really defensible. And ideally build something that then allows you to build a really big business in the future.
So I love the story on Rota. And what came next was like a period of reflection for you.
Yeah.
What do I want to spend my time on next?
Big
As
time.
I'm sure many people, watching the show, either this is their first venture or they've already exited a business and they're thinking about what comes next. Where was your head at the time?
Yeah. So, this whole role of running that team was tiring. I mean, don't get me wrong. I loved it. Like I'm never more in my element than when I'm like in the thick of something difficult like that. But it got to this point where you're having the same 3 conversations over and over again. This is the hiring conversation. This is the sales conversation. This is the funding conversation. And just like the same old ideas. And I just felt I was like 2 steps removed from helping anyone. I was managing managers who would then manage people who would then help people. So I really wanted to do things that were more hands-on in making a difference. A couple of different things I tried, and I just explored a whole bunch of things that were outside of tech, just to sort of refresh and try something completely different. One thing that I was really interested in is the way we live and the kind of communities we live in. I've always found that the people around me really shape who I was and kind of the experience I had. And obviously, kind of in my early 20s, I had this hacker house kind of experience where I had all my friends coming over and, we're doing a good job as live-in security. No one broke in, but we had a good time at the same time. So I was kind of thinking like, how do you recreate that experience for other people? And one of the first ventures after that I explored in property was, could we build these co-living facilities where you really over-index on the communal space and giving people ways to interact, and this being like a much better way to live. Now, there's been a couple of co-living facilities in London, but it really hadn't got to anywhere else in the country. So kind of part of the idea was, can we take this idea and do it either in London or elsewhere?
Yeah. Because just on that, actually, one of the things that I got when I put a question out to the listeners earlier this week was, and I asked, Will's coming on the show, what questions would you like to ask? And one of the things that came back was, how do you feel about ideas that have already been done?
Right.
Versus feeling the pressure to create from scratch. And what I hear time and time again is, you're not precious about not copying. Like, stealing is the best form of flattery.
Totally.
From what I can hear.
I mean, stealing and like just doing, in design, you'd call this copy work. So or in copywriting as well, which is just basically marketing writing. You write out what somebody has already done and you just do your best to just make that thing. And just the act of getting your hand to go through the movements teaches you to think in the way they thought when they were creating it. And so you can learn just a huge amount from doing that. So, right back to the start of like just copying Just Eat and then just putting a little twist on it that it's dry cleaning. That allowed me to understand the Just Eat model so much better than if I'd like started from a blank piece of paper and just sort of figured it out. Don't get me wrong, there's time for both, but I do think that like taking an idea that exists and like putting a twist on it, or exploring new ways to like get that idea into the market, it's just a great way to add value to people, for sure.
So then the co-living venture.
Yeah. So to get this set up, what I ended up doing was working with this old school friend who I'd played football with and just grown up with at school. This school friend had moved out to Hong Kong and was helping to build these logistics tech platforms out there. So this stuff that helps e-commerce stores manage their end-to-end delivery. Someone's put an order in, how does it arrive at the front door? So he was doing that, and there's this real need to get money out of Asia and put it into other areas to kind of diversify your assets. So a lot of people in Hong Kong and China are looking to basically invest in the UK. So it's a big thing. People say they're buying up all the flats and things like that. So what I ended up doing was going over there, doing like a roadshow of all the people that my friend Matt knew, and basically finding a backer for this co-living venture. And we found some really interested people. And I then spent a lot of time just going around different sites in Birmingham in particular and around that area, trying to find some place which we could buy. And honestly, this was a whole new world to discover. Buying a £5 million site, like what on earth was he doing? And I think this is one of those areas where, unlike tech, where you can kind of make a lot of mistakes and just keep iterating on the product and get it right, with like a really big property deal like that, you have to get all of the little details right. Like all of the contractors have to be working on time and get paid. And you can really burn your fingers in that area. So actually, to our benefit, we never found the right site. I think the right way to have done that would have been to have like started small and then built it up over, say, 10 years, which is like a more established way to build something property. But anyway, I wanted to dive into the deep ends. So we were looking for places to build this co-living stuff, and then COVID hit. And I was speaking to Matt every day because him being in Hong Kong, he was like much closer to the action. And it was kind of a terrifying situation where we didn't know how infectious this thing was. We didn't know how deadly it was or what the long-term effects of having COVID were. It wasn't really clear if we were going to contain it or if it was going to stay there, but then it came over to Italy, and then suddenly it was like everywhere. So it's just this huge period of uncertainty. And I think a lot of people in the UK, myself included, just felt this kind of onus to step up and help society in some way. So a lot of people volunteered for the NHS. Some people who were running businesses converted parts of those businesses to help create supplies, like Brewdog, turning some of their tanks into sanitizer creations. And me and Matt were talking a lot about the logistics piece of it, because that's what he's got a lot of visibility on. And we were pretty terrified around this idea of, if these logistics networks go down, every country is going to be for themselves. And there's going to be a whole bunch of resources that are essential to running the countries rather, that are going to go in short supply. In particular, medical equipment. So
masks, thermometers.
Exactly.
Basic health and safety.
Yeah. Stuff that people go through, that you can't reuse, becomes really, really difficult to get hold of once you've gone through it, So we decided to set up this operation where basically we would get as many medical devices over as we could. Me and Matt, throughout this whole process, did not take a penny out of this business. But we basically spun up this 20-person team that ended up importing 1 million units of, medical devices, like you mentioned.
You spun that team up in 2 weeks.
Yeah. So it was quite an operation. There were kind of two problems to solve. The first one was sourcing, just finding out what we should even be importing, just to know that it's going to do the job, and then finding the right place to actually source them from in China. And that was kind of where Matt stepped in. So he got this 5-person team going around to all the factories and seeing them in person. We were adamant we were only going to work with basically established suppliers, but that was really difficult because of the political climate in China. Essentially, the government said that all of the existing factories were only going to supply the Chinese people. So building relationships with those companies and trying to get some of their excess supply, where maybe some deal in China had fallen through, and so we were able to jump on that, was something that he was really interested in. On my side, even with the sourcing, what I was trying to do was figure out what was the right thing for us to be bringing in. So let me sort of back up. In going into this whole operation, I honestly had this huge amount of uncertainty about whether I should be doing it at all. Firstly, I don't know anything about this world. Not that's not stopping before, but when it comes to anything to do with medicine and health, that's a really big question mark.
There are questions in there that you don't want to get the wrong answer to.
Yeah, exactly.
And also, let's not forget the time that there were lots of businesses that were hitting the headlines for being basically scandals for PPE equipment.
Yeah, so that did come out later, and we were on the front lines of seeing that ridiculousness happen. We would be providing our good at, say, a fixed 10% markup, so we could pay our salespeople a commission. So buying something for 10p, selling it for 12p, let's see. We would lose a deal to one of these special companies that had been appointed by the government to be the supplier, who were then selling it for 70p. So there was a lot of backroom stuff going on that we stayed well clear of. But yeah, that whole ethical dilemma came out later. At this point, I'm going to wind it way back to January. It was just the case of something's going wrong. We need to step up and do something. But even then, there was this question about, should we be doing it? Do we know what we're doing? And then also, I had this huge question of well, money's going to be involved. There's an investor here who's going to be getting a return. What kind of a company do I want to make? And I spoke to my closest friends about this. It's should I do this? It's this huge opportunity to help. I'm kind of not really sure about the world I'm going into in terms of the ethics of it. I spoke to my parents. I was what do you think about this? And my parents had just really instilled in me this absolute integrity above all else. Money can come and go. You will make more money, but you can never get your reputation back.
What were their thoughts when you mentioned this to them?
My parents were yeah, that makes sense. Someone needs to do it. they were pretty like pragmatic about it. And then actually one of my best friends was like the most helpful on this. He just like, honestly, hand on shoulder moment said like, Will, I've known you for 10 years. I know whatever you do, you will make the right decisions along the way. And so we basically set out, we're going to do this mission and we're going to do it right. We're going to make sure that at every step we're figuring out how to do this in like the most ethical way to make sure that whatever happens, we're just making the best impacts. So part one of that, sourcing the materials, there's what was legal to bring in. And then there was like this completely different question, which was what is actually going to work? So like no one knew anything about the virus at this time. And so we had to go and figure out like what grade of medical mask would actually protect against this particular virus. Did a lot of work looking through papers for the last like 10 years where people have researched influenza and how that's been protected and so on. And ultimately we realized that there were like a couple of grades of masks that probably would be suitable for this. And that was like giving us a target to look for in China. And essentially what that did is we ended up going for a way, way higher quality of equipment than what a lot of other people ended up with. And what happened like 3 months later is the UK government basically banned all of these lower grade equipment, said like, yeah, there's too much rubbish coming in. And we were in this position where we'd already kind of over-indexed on the quality of the equipment. And so we were able to keep operating, which was in a good position. So that's one piece. And then the other ethical like piece that came along is there were a lot of people who were saying like, I can get you into this business if you make it worth my while. And we never did a deal like that or anything where we weren't comfortable with it. And it was such a weird position for me to be in, even to be like hearing those conversations as this like techie, you know, everyone means well kind of Silicon Valley mindset.
We're here to help the world.
Yeah, exactly. But that was the way that a lot of people seem to operate in that circumstance, which is the reality of it. And we didn't touch any of that. So yeah, ended up sourcing the stuff, getting it over here, and then had to spin up this distribution team. Like, how am I going to get this out there? Plan A was we were trying to build like a consumer facing brand that would actually work. So we're like, let's get really good quality medical stuff out to consumers. But it turned out that it was basically impossible for the platforms like Amazon and eBay to discern which companies were good quality and which weren't good quality. So what they did is they like shuttered.
I remember at the time, they delisted almost all end-to-consumer PPE that you could buy for at-home use.
And honestly, rightly so, because like a lot of stuff that came in was just like subpar.
So you were thinking at the time, if I'm not mistaken, you were thinking more, how can we get to the medical centers where people at volume are going to need repeatedly?
So we gave a whole bunch to medical. We gave a whole bunch to private businesses, like getting on an airline, you needed one, getting, there's a whole bunch of charities that I mentioned, like the food banks and so on, that we just donated a bunch to. I mean, probably the biggest buyer for us was this chain of private care homes. And yeah, how do we get, the question for us was trust. Like, how do we show people that we've done our homework and we found like the right equipment for them in this sea of charlatans, to be quite honest, like people who are jumping in on this and they're doing it in their own way. Let's call it that generously. So the way we did this is basically having this really transparent way of sharing what was going on in the factories. And we had like people in there showing them their goods being manufactured. And then at the same time, we needed people who had a relationship with them. So I built up this network of 15 salespeople who had relationships into lots of different companies already and already had that trust. And so how to spin that team up was, I was literally, again, going around asking anybody who I'd worked with before, which we're on this mission, we're trying to solve the shortage in medical equipment. We need to get this out into companies. If you have relationships, if you've done sales, you've done recruitment, if you have those kind of bonds with people, show them what we're working on, show them what we're trying to bring in, and then they can make their own decision about whether this is like what they need. And that really, really worked. And we ended up with, like, my old recruiter from my previous company was like, in there. He brought on a bunch of people who were like out of work salespeople. It was a real mismatch of like all these other people who basically put up their hand and said, yeah, I'll work for free and just get this stuff distributed.
Yeah.
And we got the job done.
You put what I heard there is you put your vision out of what you wanted to see in the world, and people that were aligned in how they wanted to help you achieve it would find you off the back of it. Either they could help you or they wanted to find somebody that could.
Exactly that. Exactly.
And then, so you worked on the PPE business. You got around 1 million units out.
Yep.
And then shortly after, you started getting into helping young men with video game addiction and recovery from that. Wind all the way back to childhood. How did we get there?
So once we had sort of finished off that project, and we were hoping it was going to be a long-term business, but it didn't turn out to be one. So we wrapped it up, and I was just again thinking about like, what are problems that I know about, that I've experienced myself, where I can get involved. Now, when I was 16 or 17, I had a somewhat mixed relationship with video games. You know, I loved them. They did not love me. I basically was stuck in this loop of getting home from school, switching on the games console, playing till I fell asleep, which when you first get into that kind of loop is like 2 a.m. But I think when I've been playing nonstop for like a couple of years, I was like able to stay up all the way through to like 7 a.m.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're getting up for school at like 9 a.m. the next morning.
Mm-hmm.
Like it was just a very, very bad place to operate from. And I ended up actually like pulling myself out of it. You know, I figured out a couple of tactics to be able to like break the habit. And then finding out different systems that worked for myself to allow me sort of to like figure out how to put a life back together after that kind of like almost dependency on something as like an outlet to focus your energy on.
I mean, how bad did it get? Because I know quite a few people that have struggled, not particularly with video games, but addiction to content, you know, addiction to gambling, addiction to porn, lots of these short-term dopamine hits. But particularly for young people, perhaps particularly for young men, I'm sure video games are only becoming more pervasive in causing addiction.
So I'm very careful about the language I use here. I don't say that video games cause addiction. What I think happens, and this is at least speaking from my own experience, is when you're going through a really tough time, these distractions can be a really useful piece of having some sanity and having a break away from what could be just a really shit experience at school or elsewhere. And that's like pretty healthy. It's good that people have like breaks. Where it becomes problematic is where, because you're only able to feel comfortable and happy in yourself, engaging in those activities, and you don't feel comfortable in the rest of the world, your brain just switches on to, how do I get more of that? Mm-hmm. How do I stay in that world longer and longer?
How do I self-preserve?
How do I self-preserve? Yeah. How do I get safe again? And that's when it can get dangerous. It's not in itself a video game. It's not in itself the porn or whatever it is. It is usually a symptom of basically being in a difficult place in your life. Mm-hmm. And pretty much everyone will go through that at some point. It's just that some of us will end up stuck in a loop in some way. So I went through that, and I came out the other side, and then like ended up, not really thinking about that in the future. You know, it was just like a phase in a way for me. But at this point in my life, when I've just finished this other medical device operation, I was kind of thinking of ways to get engaged and do a new project, and something that was, again, I wanted something that was hands-on. And I was just like, oh, it's kind of interesting that I went through that, and I've basically had a whole load of strategies that worked for me. Maybe I should go and start engaging with that. Now, again, kind of admitting that I knew absolutely nothing about this world, I went and did a course on what's called process addiction. So all those things you talked about, like gambling addiction and shopping addiction, social media addiction, which is a big thing both for men and women, they come under this umbrella term of process addiction. So I did a course and looked at like, what's the best way to be a coach? And what you're doing as a coach is you can't give people advice. you can't tell people you need to do X, Y, or Z. That's the realm of a therapist. What you can do is you can understand people's situations and listen and be there as someone that they can talk to. And it sounds really trivial, but just having that connection of somebody who cares about you and has been through the things that you're going through to make you realize that you're not weird, you're not alone in this, makes such a difference. So
out of interest, did you have this when you were suffering from video game addiction?
I absolutely did not. I did not. Yeah. I was fortunate enough to have enough other things going on that I was able to like re-divert some of my energy from video games into studying and starting to get into exercise at that point, basically trying to find like a few other outlets. But if I didn't have those, I think it'd have been a very different story for me, honestly. But yeah, I studied up, took a course on psychology just to sort of really try and understand it as deeply as I could, which was kind of like equivalent to an undergrad course. And then decided I wanted to go and be a coach. I started DMing people, messaging people, writing up my story online. Here's what I've been through. If you want someone to talk to, happy to jump on a call. No one wants to jump on a call. But I did end up basically getting in contact with either a few people who like to DM or like jump on a Discord chat and basically say like, hey, here's what I'm going through. And I would just keep in touch with them every couple of weeks. Here's what worked for me, or I've been in that situation. I've had that before, or like, oh, this sounds really serious. You need to go speak to a professional, etc. Or it was the parents. It's like parents would see this stuff and say like, hey, I think like my son might be displaying these things. Do you want to have a chat? And then I'd go and have a conversation. That was one of the most rewarding things I've done in my life. I remember like one of the success stories. There was this guy who was a really smart guy, actually a bit of an athlete, but at the same time, really, really struggling in just different areas of his life. And when I was speaking to him on this like call, which was meant to be half an hour, we ended up running for like 90 minutes. He was like glued to these two iPads and just could not look at me. So we ended up just doing that one single call and never having a follow-up. But his mum texted me about 18 months later, this video of him proposing to his girlfriend in the middle of this football stadium in America. And she just said like, yeah, that call was the moment it kind of turned around. So anyway, yeah, if I could like throw one thing out here is like, whatever you're doing, if you can do something which connects to people and like shares your story, that can be really impactful.
And perhaps for you personally, this was you'd been heads down in a business.
Yeah.
Basically different projects since uni.
Totally.
As far as I can hear. And then this was a chance to reconnect with, let's call it quote unquote, the real world.
Totally. Yeah.
Some of the very human problems that everyone experiences in their own life.
Yeah.
And then there was a moment that you were at your friend's wedding. I'd love to discuss that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm doing this like course where I'm basically trying to teach people the same skill set. I was trying to like figure out how to make a business of this, not to try and make money out of it, but honestly just to try and like scale up what I was doing. And I couldn't really figure it out. And I went over to this friend's wedding and he had everyone fly out to Greece where he was born. And we were all out there, had people from all over the world fly in to see him. There's maybe like a sea of like 150 people there. And I remember just like standing at the side at one point and looking out over it and seeing just this level of love for this couple and just realizing how important it was to be in that community and to have like a community of people around you that really care about you. So at this point, while I'm doing the video game stuff and all of this other stuff around property, I was living out of London to try and keep my costs down again. And basically I thought that like property was like better to do in the Midlands. I was really financially driven at that point. I was just like, okay, how can I keep the overheads low and maximize the profits in terms of like the property stuff at least.
Makes sense because that's what worked for you until then.
Yeah, exactly. And like just going back to this wedding, it just was this real moment of realizing that there are so many other things that are important to me in like building a great life, and living as a hermit out in the middle of nowhere to try and just focus on like these other things I was working on. Yeah, it just wasn't the right way to build that kind of life. And so I decided to come back to London and basically be in amongst my people. And like for me, my people were people who are interested in making a big impact, and that tended to predominantly be around people in tech. I find that like there's this openness and willingness to think big amongst those people that really speaks to me. And so that's the kind of community I wanted around me. So yeah, moved back to London, joined a whole bunch of communities. I know there's a lot of talk online about how you shouldn't do networking, you shouldn't go and speak to new people.
Feels like this dirty word.
Yeah.
Feels super transactional.
Exactly. Like, oh, you're giving out business cards. But while you shouldn't necessarily just do that transactional stuff, there is so much value in finding your people and spending a lot of time around them and just sharing ideas and sharing the journey with them, that I really wanted in my life. And I wasn't getting when I was out of London.
Well, I think also lots of people, you know, we sometimes can look at what's out there and we can think, okay, if I have the right actions, I get the right outcomes.
Right.
But the people that I've seen get ahead that have used, you know, similar to what you're discussing is my actions create my environment, and my environment, my community, the people around me, the things around me, how I'm setting up the support system around me to achieve what I want to achieve, then determines my outcomes.
That is so, so true. Yeah. I mean, going back to the medical device thing, we only had this stuff because I had a buddy who was out in Asia at that time who was able to coordinate us building relationships with the factories. And we were only able to distribute it because I had a relationship with my old recruiters and all these other people who then were able to make it work. Like, it was literally that community, that team that did that. And that, I mean, it's the same for like, the more I have matured as an entrepreneur, the more I'm like building a team around me to create these impacts, rather than, you know, you go right back to the first one, handing out leaflets by myself and like trying to do every little piece by myself. So yeah, I definitely think that that's one of the areas where I've grown the most.
I just hear that you have this, and I'd be curious, where does that come from for you, that agency over I own my outcomes?
So there was a whole bunch of books that talk about this stuff. But the one in particular that I really got a lot out of was this one called Extreme Ownership by Jocko Willink. Yeah, he's done the podcast tours now. He's big. But yeah, his first book, Extreme Ownership, really talks about this idea of when things go wrong, believing that it is within your control to either have prevented that or to prevent it next time. And it's a bit of a mindset shift that, you know, the word mindset has been kind of burnt out, hasn't it? But it really does help you get better faster by taking responsibility for everything. Yeah.
Well, the other side of the coin there, you know, some could argue, and I've had this conversation with friends many times, that it's unhealthy to take extreme ownership, because what you're actually doing is trying to control variables that are outside of your surface area.
Yeah, no, it totally. You have to know what you can't control and then like let that slide. And it can lead to like micromanagement as well. Like, you need to get this outcome because you're in my locus of control. So there is a healthy way to do it where you know where, if you push the lever forward, it's going to create a great outcome. And there's times when you need to let things slide and let things ride. And actually, the letting things slide piece is this like amazing superpower that came out of the video game addiction. So like on that kind of recovery period, it's really difficult because what you do is you set yourself a goal. I'm not going to play games for like the next 3 days. And your brain is telling you you need to. It's really boring. And what happens is at the start, when you're first trying to wean yourself off, after 6 hours, you've kind of got compelled and you go back and you start doing it again and you've messed up. And at that point when you've messed up, you've kind of got a decision of like, oh, well, like, fuck it. Now I might as well game until like 7 in the morning again.
What's lost is lost.
What's lost is lost. This day is ruined. It's done. Forget it. We're calling it.
Yeah.
There's
what
that.
a failure this day has been. Let's try and press reset tomorrow.
Yeah. And like, that's a place to start as long as you like can pick it up and you're not beating yourself up too much. But then I guess like this skill set you pick up is like realizing when you miss up, just to let go and begin again. And just to think, what is like the next thing I need to do? The next thing I need to do is just step out of the room. And the next thing I need to do after that is I'm going to go get myself a glass of water. And you just take these really baby steps to start getting back on track. And like that skill set of being able to like be in like a quite chaotic environment and like to have things go wrong, to miss your targets, to have a deal fall through or something, and just to be able to like reset has been so helpful in entrepreneurship. I use it every day, you know, and it allows you just to let go of things really quickly and just to move on.
There's a really famous, just while we're talking about it, YouTube video with, I think he's a really well-known basketball player, and I can't exactly put the name to the face, but I'll send you the video afterwards.
Yeah.
And this interviewer, this reporter asks him, you know, aren't you worried that you didn't get promoted in the championship, like in the equivalent of the basketball league? And the guy is silent. He's looking around and he's going, can I ask you a question? If you weren't, if you've been doing your job for 2 years and you weren't promoted, would you look at yourself and call yourself a failure? And he's like, I can only control the next shot I'm going to take.
Yeah.
So even if I realize the magnitude of how important it is to get a promotion, it gives me nothing. All I'm looking at is the next basket, the next basket.
That's so strong.
And in this process, when I was listening to it, I was thinking, to compete at the highest level, you have to be headspace taken in any direction away from what you're about to do next is headspace that is not helping propel you in that direction.
Absolutely.
And this ultimate extreme presence from focusing on the next basket.
Yep.
Easier said than done.
No, but I mean, so applicable because, when you're running a company or doing any kind of mission, you've got like all these distractions and just the ability to sit down and decide, these are the things I need to get done today. These are the things that are high priority, and the rest of the world can pause while I get those 2 or 3 things done. It's just this skill that you use whatever you're doing to achieve big things.
This also this idea of like, am I getting the most out of the day? Because I think that's what a lot of people fear. That
right.
And by not defining what a good day looks like, it allows you to move the goalposts.
100%.
You say, well, I only got one thing done today, but I didn't really know what I wanted to do anyway. Whereas so I looked at, all these productivity frameworks, and one of the most effective that I've found for myself that I keep coming back to time and time again is just start of the day, you've got one post-it note.
Yeah.
And you can put 3 things on that you want to do. And whatever happened yesterday, whatever was on that post-it note, forget it. It's done.
Yeah.
Yesterday is gone. Tomorrow doesn't exist yet. We are here. 3 things that determine if I do these 3 things, today was a good day.
Yes.
I can't get to the end. I can't get to midnight where I'm just about to go to bed and look at the 3 things and go, well, it just didn't feel like a good enough day. No, I already wrote the contract with myself this morning. 3 things equals successful day. Now, equally, this allows me to be really honest with myself. If I haven't done those 3 things,
yes.
Is it missed expectations? And you can apply this with companies to sprint planning and are we biting off more than we can chew? But ultimately, is it just an execution problem?
Yep.
Because the amount of times where I've gone, well, I just don't have the right vision. I'm not working on the right stuff. Maybe I haven't got the strategy figured out because that feels safer.
Yeah, totally.
What I really didn't want to admit to myself is that I had an execution problem. I wasn't staying focused enough in the time that I'd allotted to do those 3 things. So it's like radical. It's like this mixture of being really fair with yourself about what to expect. But once you've decided what you expect, having extreme ownership over what you expect to be achieved.
Yeah. Just being able to lock in and like tune out all the distractions to get that thing done.
Yeah. And then it becomes binary. And that is so freeing to be like, yes, no, was it a good day?
Totally.
I also asked listeners just before this podcast, what are the top of mind questions around vision? And I think what I got back time and time again is that there is this expectation that we have this vision for the future, and then we kind of move linearly, but with some struggles towards it.
Right.
But that we all know exactly where we're supposed to be going.
Yeah.
And for those people, that are watching, myself in many ways, that are still figuring out what good looks like for them, what advice would you have?
I mean, this is a very personal decision. But I think there are a couple of things that I find very, very motivating that help become like a constant North Star in amongst all of the uncertainty around trying to do something big or hard or anything. I think what you don't do is you don't lock onto this is what the end result is going to be, and it ends up being that perfect vision that you envisaged 5 years ago. That kind of like dream boarding is really difficult, and it's hard to stay locked onto that. But I think if you lock onto something that is much more tangible, which is being able to help the people directly in front of you, and like starting there with this like desire to be of service, that can be a kind of guiding star that helps you uncover these big opportunities and help you find your way to something really impactful. So yeah, I would say, honestly, for myself at least, while it's helpful to sort of think ahead, the most important thing is just to think about how can I help the people around me right now? And like, I think that kind of guides you towards building something big in the long term. Yeah.
The other thing that I'd love to get your thoughts on, we talked about it before we started recording, is taking venture money, taking outside capital, which you did in 2 of the businesses you talked about, versus bootstrapping.
Yes.
And this idea of backing your bets.
Yeah.
Placing your bets and backing your bets. Because in the first ventures, the on-demand laundry, you were the one doing everything.
Yeah.
You were going out with the kind of Just Eat printout. You were handing out leaflets, user validation, discovery testing.
Totally.
And it seems to me that one of the learnings for you is that you can not outsource, but delegate some of that validation in the early stages.
Yeah.
Help us understand that.
Yeah, definitely. So let me pick up the story from coming back to London and talk about some of the bets I placed when I came back. So I came back to London. I was really interested in getting back into tech. I wanted to do something that was going to be more scalable, make a bigger impact. And essentially, there is this idea in tech, which is useful. It is true, but it is like something that can be dangerous, that if you just keep trying and you just keep iterating, you will eventually find your £1 million idea. You'll find your huge business at the end of the rainbow. And I think one of the things that misses sometimes is that there is this big opportunity cost if you spend 4-5 years trying to find that. And there is, a certain need to get momentum on these ideas to help them take off. Because if it's too slow, it makes it really difficult for you to stick it out and get to the end result. So as I came back into tech and I was sort of trying to explore different technologies, trying to speak to a lot of potential customers and like understand what their pain points were, I wanted to accelerate that process as much as I could so I could just pack in all of that learning into the minimum amount of time. To do that, I kind of started to build up my own little innovation lab of team of people who I could give part of the problem to figure out. So I spent a while thinking about productivity tooling, and whereas before I might have spent a lot of time building those tools and then also spend a lot of time speaking to customers and it would take me maybe 12 months, this time I just focused all my energy on speaking to customers. I figured out kind of what the tool should look like, and then I was just kind of willing to place a bet on a freelancer to build it or a videographer to try and make a cool hype video to try and get this thing off the ground. And what I ended up with was this, innovation lab of maybe like 5 different UX, UI designers, engineers, people who could build stuff while I went and explored the market that allowed me basically to move much, much quicker and get some momentum on some of these ideas. And I kind of went into the lab for about 2 years. So even though I'd raised money for my previous business, I have this really strong view that actually, one, you don't need money to really start a business. You just don't these days. You can get things off the ground by just speaking to people and building something quite quick and scrappy. And that's all you need to validate. And secondly, as an entrepreneur, it's actually not in your best interest to raise too early, because you'll spend a whole lot of time thinking about investors and what they want instead of thinking about customers and their problems and what they need. So my perspective, very strongly held, is that you should go as far as you can to validate and prove you've got a business first. And if you do that, then investors will really pile in and they will support you building a big business out of that if you want to raise capital. And if not, a lot of people also then don't even need capital, and that can be a really good outcome too. So that was like 2 years of my life just learning and building and delegating a lot of the work.
You were working in your innovation lab, that you call it, with these different freelancers, and you're exploring lots of ideas around productivity.
Yep.
We live in a world where there's a tool for everything.
Totally.
Within productivity. Trello, Asana, Jira. If you're a developer, you've got everything. All bases are covered, so it seems. But
right.
Now you're working on Workflow, which is the platform to build, your life's work as a creative and share it with your clients. So how did that start?
Yeah. So a lot of these ideas start with some personal pain. I think that's honestly the best place to start, because I think this is a Tim Ferriss quote: if you can find something that's a personal pain, at least you've got one customer who really believes in it. And so one of the pains I had running Rota was we had this really efficient product team where the engineers just spent their whole time building products. They weren't managing busy work, and they weren't typing out things in Slack and managing the project manager. They were just shipping products. And the marketing function and the creatives we had, these really talented designers, were spending time in emails and like copying and pasting things. There was like 5 or 6 different files flying around for every asset that we were trying to produce. It was really hard to keep track. And basically that team was just very distracted and quite slow. I was perpetually frustrated with how slow the marketing team were. Not their fault, but it was just like the process set them up to fail. So I was kind of started to think more and more about this problem space of how do we make creatives operate as efficiently as devs? And there's these ideas that are really powerful in dev that just haven't kind of made it across the bridge to marketing. So for example, in dev, when you write code, you also write these automated tests. It's called automated testing. Basically means that everything you ship just works. You don't need like an army of people checking it and testing it. Whereas in creative, everything you make has to be checked by like 3 other people, and you have to wait 8 hours until you've had their review because you don't want to put a typo out there and embarrass yourself. So the whole process gets like slowed down by this review process. And then another piece that's really interesting in dev is like centralized review. And so you can see this pattern of devs pushing code to the central point where a manager can go through and check everything. Whereas in creative land, it's like all bets are off. Like people are throwing files around. You don't know what's going on. So I was just like, can we take some of those analogies across and build a platform that allows creatives to spend all their time on the creative work? And I was in the lab and trying out different ideas in this space. And what I first started with as a vision was absolutely nothing like what we ended up building. So my first idea was, could you have almost like Tinder for design ideas? So you can send that to a client and they can like swipe through the ideas they like and they don't like. And that was an absolutely terrible idea that nobody ever was going to want. But fortunately, before building that, I went and spoke to a whole bunch of different creatives and said like, okay, I'm kind of thinking about exploring this space. I've got some vague ideas, but I'm not going to tell you. I just want you to tell me what the problem is. And over that 2-year period, I just got in as many interviews as I could with people saying, I don't know what the problem is you have. I don't even know like what your world looks like. Just admitting you know nothing. And what people told me was that the feedback process was really, really bad.
So this is within agencies, you've got a bunch of client projects. You maybe have internal people designing, you have marketers, but you also might be working with freelancers and the client. And it's this messy kind of information going in all directions.
Totally.
And Will is just saying, there's got to be some better way of doing this.
Yeah.
Based on how I see developers working together.
Exactly.
How did you go about getting in those conversations to even get that first feedback?
So this is a bit of a hack, but basically, if you go to people and you say, I'm really interested in this space, can I buy you a coffee or sit down with you for an hour? I'll just come to you, just sit in your office. You'll be surprised how many people will just want to tell you about their problems. If you can list out what you think their problems are and then just get them into a conversation, they will talk for hours. But then again, trying to place bets to accelerate that, I actually just said, hey, I will pay for an hour of your time. Mm-hmm. And then most people don't take you up on that and they don't charge you. But what they would do is they would understand that I wasn't going to waste their time. I really valued it. And that allowed me to get in the door with a lot of higher value creatives. The creative director at a unicorn, for example, came and sat down with me because I was serious about making this worth their time.
And for anybody else setting up this business, they might think, well, if we want to scale this, we want to go speak to the biggest creative agencies.
Right.
But you were really intentional about finding these small, fast-moving, actually really wanted to solve problems in their business, weren't bogged down by bureaucracy and process, so that you could get it fresh from the coalface.
Totally. So contrary to everything that works in marketplaces where you want to get big as soon as possible and you want to go in for the big ones, with this kind of productivity software, what's really important is you have people who are believers, who are willing to give you a try, and they're willing to move fast and get involved with it. Mm-hmm. What you don't want to do is get bogged down in going through procurement and IT and all this stuff. So it was really important that we came in for small companies, and that applies to any software. Actually, in creative, there's also this other reason to start out by winning over the end users, which is if you can make something that the creatives themselves love to use, and creatives have a ridiculously high bar for what good looks like. If you ever sit with a creative and talk to them about what they think of their software, they are the bitchiest people you've ever met. They just tear it to shreds because they've got this design eye and they can see all the issues you've got. So we were if we can win over creatives, we can then roll that out to the rest of the business. Mm-hmm. If we instead win over people who are at the top, then it won't work. Now, I know that sounds very specific to our business, but the more applicable, generalizable lesson from this is when you're going into a market, trying to be very intentional about who is it very important that adopts this tool. Right. And for us, the end users and the tastemakers, which are these small studios who show everybody else what's cool, were really important. And so we really wanted just to start there. And then we can solve the rest later. And
that feels when you think about risks in the business, right? The risk in the business at that point is, going back to it, they have 100 productivity workflow type tools already.
Totally.
The biggest risk is no one cares about workflow. So right. How did you think about all of the problems you could solve versus the real problem that you could solve?
The essential thing is just speaking to people and asking what their problems are right at the outset, and then building the entire business around that number one problem they have. So if I'd come up with this tool and I was oh, this will be really awesome, I'll just try and build this and get this into people's hands, what you'd probably end up doing is being something that's number 5 on their list of priorities. And it's really hard to get people to adopt stuff because they're so busy. Whereas what we've done is just gone in there and asked them what are the top things on your priority list and how do you solve it today? And feedback and making sure you didn't have endless revisions of things. It's just the biggest pain point for creatives. And because you start with the pain and you've started with that problem area and you've then built a business around that, the sales piece is really, really easy because people are already looking for this and they're thinking about it all day.
What were in workflows example, problems that you thought you wanted to solve that no one actually cared about?
Yeah, well, swiping through designs is one of them. Nobody cares about this idea of, hey, if I check what my client wants before I build, I can build something correct the first time. because actually people don't like their clients' taste anyway. So they just want to design their own stuff.
They need to show they care.
They need to show they care. They need to learn about what that person thinks is good, but ultimately it's going to be expression of their own like creativity. So that was obviously this like wild idea when I was first starting. I guess more tangibly, going through different iterations of the products, there were some things that I thought were going to really matter that actually didn't matter that much. One of them, I'll tell you one that did work and one didn't work. I really believe in like async video as a way of communicating around creative work. Like things like Loom, already amazing.
Vidyard, big businesses.
Excellent. And so good because you get this high bandwidth and easy to produce way of like sharing an idea. So in workflow, one of the first things I did was build this tool where you could upload an asset, send it to someone, and when they got it, they could run this screen recorder, but built into the link, so they didn't have to install an extra piece of software. That worked really, really well. But then another thing I built was you can put comments on top of the asset, and you can also draw on the asset and kind of like express yourself through that. And what it turns out is that nobody draws on the assets. People will click on something and type out like, this is wrong, let's make this bigger. But the actual necessity to like go and draw a shape of like, let's make the button this big, nobody needs it. And one thing that we have been really good at, even though it's absolutely excruciating, is unshipping. So when you build something and you spend a huge amount of time on it and realize it's not going to work, just take it out. I'll actually give you an example of that. I tend to be very, for better or for worse, I see my parents for maybe 2 days every Christmas. And then I use the rest of the time between Christmas and New Year's, usually to lock myself in a room and just like get out a lot of code. That's not for everyone. That's just, for me, that time is just sacred because it gets me back in touch with building technology again. It's something I'm really passionate about. So yeah, this Christmas I did this and I don't know, it still felt wrong with me to like not spend as much time with my parents and like with my family as I wanted to, but I had these goals I wanted to do in the business. And so I was like, I'm going to tear myself away and build this thing. And I ended up building this way of synchronizing what you're doing from Figma into workflow that was really clever and automated. You just clicked one button and it just like magically zapped everything across.
This is one of the features that I see a lot of your users on Twitter check out workflow because it's so easy to import from Figma.
Yeah, exactly. So it's cool. But the first version of that, the version I built then, I tested it like January 2nd, as soon as everyone came back to work, and users just didn't get it. This whole magical, you press a button and it kind of works. Users were genuinely just confused by it. And what we've ended up doing is like there is still a connection between the two software tools, but like it's a completely different thing. So like January 2nd and January 3rd, I was testing this out. January 4th, I just ripped the whole feature out. And it was pretty heartbreaking because like I hadn't just like put in a couple of weeks of time to build this thing.
You put in Christmas.
I put in Christmas, yeah. And I'd like, made some sacrifices to make that thing work. And while I don't think that was like necessarily the wrong thing to do, because ultimately you do need to keep things moving, I think it takes a real discipline to like, it's called kill your darlings in writing. You have like a phrase or a paragraph you'd love, but if it doesn't fit with the overall vision, you just got to put a line through it. It's got to go. Yeah.
Yeah, especially painful if you were the one that wrote all the code.
Big time. Yeah.
Talk to us about your users. So when you say creatives, that kind of feels like everyone today. I can go online and I can use ChatGPT, Figma, and a bunch of other low-code, no-code tools to build pretty much anything.
Yeah.
Who are you solving a problem for and where do they live? How do you get close to these users?
Yeah. So we are intentionally staying relatively broad in our definition. So part of our vision is accelerating or helping every creative out there. And the problem is if you focus in too much on any one area in this vision, you can end up just funneling in and being a small part of that world. So we could be like a feedback tool just for videographers. And that's just not what like lights us up as a team. Like there's no rational logic behind this in but we just want to build something much, much bigger than just helping out one corner of the market. So for us, creatives is anyone working with imagery, like photography or whatnot, video, web designers. It could be audio, podcasts, any type of creative work that you want to be able to get feedback on and manage through the process we're going after. And then there was kind of a decision about like, how do we reach out to people? Are we going to be like cold emailing them? Am I going to be meeting them at events? We decided that actually Twitter was like the most important area for us, because if things work in that like very difficult space of Twitter and people are sharing you and they are talking about you, then you get this kind of multiplier effect from that community where somebody sees somebody else doing it, and then 5 days later, they see another tweet about you and people start to become very, very aware of you. And that's one of the cool things that we've actually seen over the last few weeks, is that we're starting to see like a lot of people talking about us who we haven't reached out to, but because they've actually seen like the activity going on. So yeah, we've been big believers in that. I mean, we're getting to a stage of the company now where we've got a couple of 100 users on board, and we're kind of thinking, how do we get that to a couple of thousands? And we now need to branch out much, much further. But there was a really careful decision about where we put all our efforts at the start, and like Twitter, or X as it's called now, was like for us a really big proof point for us to win over.
And then if you think about going forward, I'm curious, what keeps you up at night?
Yeah, so we're in this situation where we've got a product out there. There is a couple hundred teams who are very vocal about what they want in the platform next, and we have like such a long list of available features. At the same time, we've got kind of our vision for where this market needs to go. These kind of innovative features which nobody's asking for, but we're pretty convinced will be game changers for these teams. So the most difficult thing for us right now is figuring out what is our path through this. Do we optimize for the teams that are using us right now and make them really happy with something that's like incrementally better? Or do we continue to place big bets on AI creative review, AI comparison of versions, one versus the previous, all of these things that we think will really accelerate people? And yeah, making those decisions is super, super tough. There's like only so far the data can take you. And ultimately you need to make a decision about what kind of company you want to build and kind of where the balance sits for us. And yeah, I don't have a strong answer there. What I would say is we're trying to keep our approach to solving that problem super scrappy and place a lot of bets, but do it in a way where we're validating those bets before we go all in and build something big. So ideally, if we think it's AI review, build a proof of concept, get it into the hands of 10 people next week, see if they use it. I think the mistake you can make when you've had like a bit of early success is to like think you're all that, and then you start building some crazy big features. And what I've seen happen time and time again is that flops because you've lost the discipline you had about validating and asking customers and letting them drive it.
If we fast forward 3 years into the future and we're looking at workflow and how big it's become and how successful it has been in helping creatives, what are we looking at?
So we're just in this really interesting time in creative where there's so much creative work being produced. There's this crazy stat from last year that more photos were generated than have ever been taken by photographers through like the history of time. But that kind of like text to video to text to photo is happening in every different modality. You've got text to video coming out of Sora. You've got text to website, text to UI now with like Figma's just come out with that at FigCon a few days ago. And so what we're seeing is that you're going to have this world where not only is there like 10 times the amount of assets, but also there are 10 times the number of creative people who can go and just do the work. So our view is that a lot of the tooling that's been built before has been built for this kind of professional creative. And actually what we need to do is help accelerate all of these people who are coming into the market for the first time. And they've just figured out Figma, but they've been able to do quite a lot because they can use the AI and it can be really, really productive. Or they are a student and they're excited and they want to start doing a studio on the side of their studies? How do you help that person get up to speed? They don't know ClickUp and Trello and Monday. So you need something that's like a lot simpler and more intuitive than those like enterprisey tools. So like, I think we'll have succeeded if there's a whole bunch of people that can now run a creative career really simply, who previously would basically have been put off the whole thing because it's actually really hard work to do creatively. And I can give a personal story of that happening. So when I was a teenager, I was really interested in getting into the video game industry. I was studying game design. I was reading like a stack of books. I was doing modifications, building things. And then I decided to get my first job. And I landed this job in this little tiny like game dev studio in Oxford, which was where I grew up. And it sucked. Like, it was awful. Everybody in there really hated the work because it wasn't designing great games. It was checking and testing all these games. Like, there was a driving game they were building, and someone's job for 6 hours was to drive around the edge of the course and make sure the car couldn't fall through the universe. Like, it was this dumb stuff that was distracting everybody from doing great work. And I was just like, I don't want any piece of this, and like ran away from the game design industry entirely. And like, I kind of don't want creatives to be in that land where actually the job of a creative is like chasing after clients for feedback, or it is, you know, managing stuff in a project manager. So if we're successful, what I'd love to see is like people spending more time doing creative work.
So you posted recently about Jevons paradox, and it was the first time I'd come across it. Tell us more about that.
So Jevons paradox is this kind of phenomenon in economics where sometimes when you have a lot more of a good, like for example, you have way more taxis on the road because Uber's come out. Just because you have more and maybe the costs have gone down, it doesn't actually necessarily mean that you're going to end up with no industry and all the prices go down, and it kind of kills the industry. What a lot of people are afraid of in AI coming into creative work is it's going to make creative work free, essentially, and you're not going to have a business there. But actually what we've seen in like a lot of industries is where basically because the costs come down to create, it's actually been able to enable more demand and people actually see more of it. So I'll give you an example of this. As the cost of like airline travel has come right down, the amount of people doing airline travel has gone way up and demand has still outstripped supply. So just the whole industry has grown, and actually for airline carriers, it's now more profitable than ever to be an airline carrier. So I kind of see the same thing happening in creative work. As it gets easier to produce creative work, there's probably going to be all of these places where previously you couldn't do creative work, but now suddenly you can. Like maybe I'm hiring and previously I couldn't give a video demonstration of what our culture is like because getting a full video that shows off the team and shows off everything we're doing costs a lot of money. Videographer, it's going to be like £1,000 to get that whole thing shipped. If suddenly AI enables you to get that done for £200 or £50, suddenly all these people can be creating videos to share what they're doing at work and what their life is like. So you have like this abundance of demand and abundance of like creative work being made. So it's kind of like Jevons paradox is basically even as it gets cheaper to make things, the industry under them can actually really thrive. And I'm kind of seeing that happening with creative.
To finish this off, I'd love to ask you a personal question.
Yeah, please.
So if you fast forward and we're both, I'm not going to say how old by the time we're in a rocking chair, but we're both there in a rocking chair, and we're looking back and we're saying, wow, Will, all the things that you built, all the ventures that you've been on, what was it all for?
Ooh, that's a good one. I think that it's about making an impact. If it's a really, really cheesy phrase, and you can only really like describe it through weird anecdotes. But it is about, you know, that story I told about the person proposing. When I was running Rota, I once went on a date in Birmingham where we were trying to set up an office, and the waiter came up to me and was like, "Hey, Will, are you Will?" And I was like, "Yeah, do we know each other?" He was like, "Yeah, you're the guy from Rota, you're in the emails." And like I was giving this guy his job, and like we were employing like thousands of people at that point, but I was so disconnected. I'd completely forgotten that like these are real people who we were like putting bread on the table for. So like, honestly, if we look back in the future and we can say like, there's been a huge impact from what you've done, that would be all I need to hear. That'd be amazing.
Will, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming in.
Hey, pleasure to be here.